Distinguished guests, respected speakers, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum, and a very warm welcome. Thank you so much on behalf of the American Business Forum and LUMS to all of you for joining us this evening. So on behalf of the American Business Forum and LUMS, I'm Marwa, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's policy dialogue. We're gathered today at a very critical economic juncture. This is a moment that calls for clarity of vision, for courageous reform, and for collaborative leadership. And our forum today aims to contribute meaningfully to the national conversation as Pakistan's budget priorities take shape ahead. And I want to begin with a brief introduction of our hosts for the evening. So the American Business Forum, ABF, is a platform that brings together senior leaders from across business, policy, academia, and industry to contribute meaningfully to economic reform and dialogue on sustainable growth. The ABF has worked consistently to bridge the gap between the private sector and policymakers and to support evidence-based decision-making. Our co-host, LUMS, is one of Pakistan's leading academic institutions, known for its excellence in research, in thought leadership, and in public policy engagement. Through its faculty and centers, LUMS plays a vital role today in shaping informed dialogue and national discourse. To find out more about the great work both these institutions are doing, you can visit the desks that we have at the side of the hall. I hope you get a chance to do that. And to formally open today's session, it's my honor to invite the president of the American Business Forum, a member of the LUMS Management Committee, and CEO of Feroz Sons Laboratories, Mr. Usman Wahed. Mr. Wahed serves on the board of a number of organizations across the public and private sector, and he's a champion for advancing growth across Pakistan. So please welcome Mr. Wahed.
Thank you very much, Marwa. Good evening, everyone. This is in no way meant to be a visual for the Pakistani economy. I just wanted to make that clear from the outset. But Dr. Dercon, honorable panelists, members of the diplomatic corps, representatives of multilateral agencies, leaders of the business community, distinguished ABF members, and distinguished members of the LUMS alumni community. Good evening. As Marwa briefly mentioned, the American Business Forum represents US companies, their subsidiaries and affiliates operating in Pakistan. Our members are companies that are vested in and invested in Pakistan's economic success, and we are very proud to be partnering with LUMS, the country's premier multidisciplinary university, on a series of thought leadership sessions and events focused on the Pakistani economy. Unfortunately, we have existed over several decades in an ecosystem that is rent-seeking and transactional in nature. We are victims of short-term thinking, and I don't just lay the blame on this for the government. The private sector equally has been very short-term focused and rent-seeking in nature. This is why every year as the budget approaches, we approach government with suggestions on reducing interest rates or tweaking this tax here or that tariff there, and the long-term economic reform that desperately needs to take place in Pakistan gets ignored by the wayside. And that's what we hope to change through these series of engagements, is to help be part of that larger collective nudge towards serious long-term reform in Pakistan. This evening session, Reset, which is the first in this series, could not have a better set of participants. Professor Dercon, Marwa will introduce him formally, but he's one of the world's leading development economists, and his book, Gambling on Development, is a seminal work that I would recommend everyone in this room to read. So in true LUMS fashion, we're also giving you homework today. In the discussants, we're very honored to have Mr. Bilal Azhar Kayani, Minister of State for Finance and Railways. I know Bilal as a progressive and deep thinker, and as a bridge builder, which is a critical skill in the context of making reform reality. So Bilal, the country's hopes weigh very heavily on you. You should just know that. Similarly, Mr. Ali Naseer, who is here also, is a corporate leader with over 30 years of experience. He started his career in the civil service, and as such would be able to give us deep insight on how a reset can actually happen. Our moderator, of course, Dr. Ali Hasanain, needs no introduction. He's former chair of the economics department. and his work in technology, media, and information systems, and their role in improving service delivery and market functioning is very well known. I know there's an earth-shattering cricket match at the other end of this session, so we'll keep it tight. And just for everyone to know, there's no need to rush out of this room the moment it's 6:30, because the screen will then show you the results, the score as well. So please stay on, and we look forward to your presence also in future sessions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Usman Saab. My introduction should have included your sense of humor. So I know we have a number of LUMS alumni in the room. So in a special moment for you, I'm really excited to now introduce you to the Director of Advancement at LUMS, who is also a fellow alum. He's from the MBA class of 2009. So on behalf of LUMS, please welcome Mr. Ali Ibrahim.
Honorable State Minister, dignitaries, ladies and gentlemen, fellow alumni, my team, Assalamu alaikum. I welcome you all to this important policy dialogue, which brings together industry and academia at a very critical juncture when Pakistan is rethinking its growth priorities, what the next future is going to look like, and how we can all play our part in terms of making sure that we support the sustainable ecosystem. It is particularly very heartening for me, what Marwa just mentioned, to see our fellow alumni who represent different industries, corporate sectors, public policy, who take the LUMS badge into boardrooms, startups, entrepreneurial ventures, and global corporations wherever they go out within the country and outside the world. So your presence reinforces the very core belief that universities do not operate in isolation. They exist in continuous dialogue with the society. As an alumni myself, I have experienced this firsthand, how LUMS prepares graduates for conversations like these around public policy discourse. LUMS goes beyond the functional training to develop rigorous inquiry-based and multidimensional thinking that allows our graduates the ability to solve complex problems. At LUMS, as part of our institutional mission, research is not just an adjunct entity for us. It sits at the epicenter. We understand and respond to major challenges that our country currently faces, whether it's economic reform, fiscal sustainability, public health systems, climate resilience, energy transformation, AI systems. Everything is organized around thematic verticals that matter profoundly to the country's long-term future. Through our schools and research centers across economics, business, law, science and engineering, and social sciences, we generate evidence-based research that informs policy, strengthens institutions, and delivers real-world impact beyond academia. By integrating these disciplines into the classroom, we offer that kind of experiential learning where students tackle live data, real policy challenges, and Pakistan-relevant challenges and solutions. Today's dialogue reflects precisely why we are gathered over here, where we bridge to seek and strengthen the relationship between academia and industry. Research must inform enterprise. Industry must inform curricula. Policy making must be grounded in data and insight. And as alumni who sit over here at the intersection of all these worlds are critical to make sure that this is something which we can sustain over the long term. I look forward to the conversation that is going to emerge and some of the insights that will come forward from this evening, and to strengthen this shared commitment between industry, academia, our valuable partners, the American Business Forum, and our remarkable alumni committee. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ali Saab. I hope that we can also carry forward the enthusiasm that you're bringing to this evening. It's my pleasure now to move to our keynote address for the evening. As Usman Saab said, we're very, very lucky to have our keynote speaker here today. It's a privilege to introduce Dr. Stefan Dercon, Professor of Economic Policy at the University of Oxford. Dr. Dercon is a globally recognized and respected development economist whose work has shaped thinking across the world on growth, poverty reduction, and state capability. He has served as the chief economist at UK's Department for International Development, and he he's advised governments across Asia and Africa on economic strategy and reform. He's also the author of the influential book, Gambling on Development. As Usman Saab said, your homework is already laid out for you. We hope you get a chance to pick up a copy if you haven't. And today, Dr. Dercon will share a strategic perspective on the economic outlook and fiscal priorities ahead. So please join me in giving him the welcome he deserves. Please welcome Dr. Stefan Dercon.
Right. Thank you very much. Look, first of all, I hope I won't speak too long. I want it to be largely something that offers a space for discussion. So I want to thank the organizers and the insistence of the organizers that we should do something like this. It's great to be able to do this. I just want to actually start by don't overstate my role, okay? I'm a bit like in the, your cousin's uncle's doctor who gets called upon to give a bit of a second opinion when, your local doctors have already for a long time said what you have to do. There are also a few quacks around that say all kinds of things that you also should be doing. And so within that noise, you want to know actually maybe a second opinion. I see myself being called in somehow. Can I help as a second opinion in terms of the diagnosis? Can I help to identify who are the quacks and who are the real doctors? Similarly, in terms of the treatment, can I get a little bit of a sense of that? So I was a civil servant also in the UK government, as people were saying, a chief economist. I was a technocrat. It's really always good to be able to say, look, advisors advise, it's ministers that decide. And it's just it. But let me try to give you a sense of where I think we are and what needs to be done. So look, I think it's not wrong, even though it's fragile, to actually talk about stabilization as being quite successful, okay? I want to invite the business people to think what January 23 looked like, okay? So that's a very different world you looked at. You couldn't get any dollars, couldn't get anything imported there, no resources and so on. And everything was really complicated. So, inflation is, it's more or less, it's definitely brought down. Let's put it like this. Foreign reserves are growing. And the IMF is, broadly speaking, quite happy. And yeah, it's maybe, people will say, well, that's a typical thing. We do this for a couple of years, and then actually pressures will rise. And yes, we wouldn't be in this meeting, and there wouldn't be all these cameras if there is not a lot of people that think, yeah, this is the moment. Actually, SBP is saying, growth is 4.75%, at least as the forecast, because agriculture seems to have done better than expected despite the floods. But of course, there's other statistics that really still concern me. Export is barely 10% of GDP. Investments is 13%, but there's 4% public investment, so it's like less than 10% private investment as well. Business people here in the room are not investing, and there's not enough exporting going on as well. So what does the business community want? I do get the WhatsApps as well. I do get the messages and the invitations and so on. Actually, in some sense, it's not the same what politicians want. In fact, what a lot of people want. We want growth in this country. We do want the economy to grow. Okay, so I have bad news for you to start with, but just a word of caution. What economic research tells us, multiple people have done this piece of research. The Asian Development Bank, I understand the State Bank of Pakistan has done a similar piece of research recently. World Bank people have researched this. Once this economy, in its current structure, gets to about 3.8 or 4.2% growth, let's book the flights to Washington to get a new IMF program. Okay? So if the State Bank says 4.75% growth, that's 0.75, I'm worried because the structure of the economy isn't really changing. We see that. Investment is low, exports is low. We still have an economy where virtually anything that's earned is consumed. A lot of it by the government, but not just that. A lot of it also by people. Investment and savings rates are very low. You know, and it's both sides. It's government consumes a lot, and private sector, private individuals and so on consume a lot. Export is too low. And we also haven't quite managed to do the kind of reforms to make this a state of the 21st century. This is actually still a pretty inefficient state to global standards in its own operation. And it does far too much. It either has or encourages monopolies. It encourages a lot of firms that it shouldn't be in sectors that it shouldn't be doing. So actually, if you think of it, okay, the structure of the economy, and I've just described it, a low investment, low export, and too much parts of the state, not all of it, there's some pretty efficient parts of the state, but too many of the state parts are actually inefficient as well. So you get all these things together, well, that's the structure. So what you're talking about, where are the structural reforms? It's actually changing that structure, and it's not just something here or some benefit here or there. But I want to repeat again, the research tells us that if the economy starts growing more than 4% in this structure, just get ready to book the flights of the finance minister to go to Washington. Now, I ask my question, is that what you want? That we actually go to an IMF program 25, 26, 27? I don't think anyone wants this. But I do have the impression, and I'll come back to it, that a lot of voices in this society just don't understand that you can't have the cake and eat it. You can't push the envelope out without thinking about, well, where will it come from? What will it mean? And for a moment, I'm actually not even necessarily talking about a fiscal deficit. Of course, all these things are interlinked. But I'm just talking about the balance of payments that cannot sustain a lot of the things that a lot of people are asking for, including many of the business associations. So I just want to make sure that that gets clocked. When I talk to individual businesses, and I spent my time in the last week also in Karachi, I talked to endless business leaders here as well in Islamabad, all kinds of events that were organized by friendly, let's call it a friendly embassy, where actually we were talking to endless business people. And once we go behind it, people are more reasonable. But I would actually ask in the first instance, don't make all this push that you have where there is a sense that a reaction needs to come on a large scale, a push because, if we push hard, we'll get a little bit. No, can I assure you, in policy-making terms, you make chaos, okay? And there's a lot of people that believe that actually we can do. So I'll come back to this in a moment. I want to explain what it means to do structural reforms. And I will also talk about countries that did them. China started doing them in the 1980s and in the 1990s. India did them in the 1990s. US and Europe had to do it in the 1980s as well, because the structure of the economy had to change. I ended up coming from Belgium into Britain during the miners' strike because, yes, structural transformation was happening. And it is difficult. It's politically difficult, it is socially difficult, it is for businesses difficult. But I'm afraid my message is here, if you want the structure of the economy in Pakistan that can grow, you'll need to be partners thinking through how can we get to this. Okay? So, exports have to happen, right? It's important, it's existentially important for this economy. And I'm saying existentially, because if we can't get a trade balance that works better, can't rely on the remittances all the time, and I know part of the remittances are probably payments for other exports in IT, but it's not enough. If we want a stable trade balance, we need to be thinking about, 10% of GDP. It's the lowest in Asia, and it's really too low to be comfortable. It needs to be really increasing dramatically. And, how to do it? Well, we need to find a way. But we have to do it in a way that stability is maintained. Because if we undermine the stability today, while doing this, and all the proposals that are coming, I'll come back to this, all the proposals that come in say, we will only do it if you do this for the tariff, if you do it for the electricity tariff, and you do this for CIT, and you did for this and this and this, and the shopping list is very long. Say, okay. But, how do we do this? How do we work together to think through it? And I want to emphasize what does structural change mean, structural reforms mean. They mean that at a moment in the economy, especially capital is not necessarily in the right place. Capital is not in the place where it should be to have a structure of the economy that actually can grow. Capital is allocated in parts that actually are not competitive, but they are there because there are all kinds of incentives for the capital to be there. And so we just mean, not all of it, and I'm sure there's lots of good businesses here, but there is some of the capital it's there. So, there is not enough capital on the frontier where investment pays up because Pakistan is competitive. Okay? I want to give you a few figures here. In the last 30 years, everybody complains about the electricity tariff today and the taxes here. In the last 35 years, productivity growth in Pakistan has been 1/10 of what Vietnam has achieved and 1/5 of what India has achieved. Okay? Now, that's not just because today there happens to be a super tax, okay? That's not just like that. I can assure you it doesn't help, but it is there. And so we need to kind of really think what actually we'll be getting it. Okay, the structural change that happened in Europe and in the US happened in a lot of low-income countries, and Pakistan in 1990 was a low-income country. It happened since 1990 in quite a lot of places. In fact, low-income countries since 1990 are the fastest growing income group. Countries that were low income in 1990. And again, I say Pakistan was part of it, together with India, with China, with Vietnam, and so on. They were the fastest growing economies in the world. They grew by per capita terms 5.4% per year since 1990. Pakistan did in this period in per capita terms 1.8%. It was below the median of all the low-income countries. How did all these economies manage to grow? The ones that were successful, because they took the one opportunity that was suddenly offered, they engaged with globalization. Pakistan looked inwards and didn't do it. And Pakistan looked inwards in a way that actually created a whole series of issues. In fact, if you compare those countries, it's about 25 of them, that were growing more than the median growth for low-income countries in that period. Again, Pakistan is not in it, but India is in it, China is in it, Vietnam is in it. There's three characteristics that they did that Pakistan didn't do. Put it differently, there's a significant difference between these fast growers and the ones that stayed behind. They managed to actually become more open and be more an economy that engaged with the global economy, very strongly so. They engaged with globalization, as I alluded to. They basically opened up their economy for competition. At the same time, they started to export more. And they focused on exports and gaining this. And a lot of the measures that they took were focused on supporting exports further. They also cut down on regulatory controls. And the data I'm quoting is actually from Fraser Institute that has done, since the late 1980s, done this for every country in the world. Their index of regulatory quality, Pakistan was amongst the lower, and all the successful ones, they improved the regulatory environment, the regulatory quality. And also the regulatory burden went down. And finally, they improved the legal and property rights systems for commercial law. Contract enforcement, property rights, they did. Pakistan stayed behind. They stayed behind on engagement with globalization, looked inwards, and then all the other things that I mentioned, they made more complicated. And they didn't progress. Now, what is structural reform? Very easily, it's changing that. It's fundamentally going and doing what the fast-growing low-income countries that outpaced the growth in high-income countries 3 to 4-fold in this period, is to say, maybe we want to belong to that group of lower middle-income countries that are doing far better than the high-income countries in the world. Now, How do I compare that with what I hear in terms of proposals and lobby work from business associations and from lots of other people in the political space, and indeed from journalists and commentators, and they also say, and a lot of quacks, that actually shouldn't really be commenting on the economy because they have clearly little clue about it. But people read it. Actually, finance minister called it, they want a sugar rush. They want a fiscal stimulus as quickly as possible. In fact, proposals have been collated that probably, and I can't be exact, but they probably add up to 1.5% of GDP things. These were proposals came from business associations and from other quarters. 1.5% of GDP. Now, I just want to actually, those who are a little bit economic literate, even if we don't have a multiplier from this, we'll add 1.5% of, we behave as if we will get some extra growth. Even if we only get 1% extra growth from this, we'll be at 5% growth with the same structure of the economy. Okay? Then we'll definitely book our flights to Washington. The one thing I want to really say is that in the situation we are, and I'll be the first to say that there's a lot of taxation that shouldn't be there. But unwinding this cannot be done, in my opinion, through an across-the-board reduction in all kinds of sales taxes, CITs, everything under the moon. Because we'll have to be, as much as we can, keeping economic stability so that we don't end up in the same situation of January 2023. So we'll need to think carefully about what can we do now to get there. You know, one of the worst visits by an international expert in recent time to this country was by Mr. Ron Laffer. He came to talk to a lot of people, and everybody talks about the Laffer curve now. Mr. Ron Laffer is something we teach at university in terms of saying, how do you spin a story? And it serves a politician. He did this for Ronald Reagan's election team. And he drew on a napkin a curve that says, why don't you give the impression that taxes, if we increase them, will actually, if we reduce taxes, we'll actually get more revenue. Why don't you draw this picture that we're already past the optimal point, that if we now reduce taxation, you'll definitely get more revenue. Because you've encouraged so much activity that we will immediately start investing and growing this economy. Now, I know that all the taxation hurts you. It hurts your profitability. But that's not the same as saying, from the moment you get a CIT cut, you're all going to invest again. I hear at the same time you say there's a lot of things that will stop us from investing. That may be one thing, but we need more. And so basically, Ron Laffer put it in the heads of people, just reduce the taxes, and you'll have immediately investment, and the structure changes. Now, by the way, if I get investment only in domestic-facing economy and no exporters, I'm still going to the IMF because I'm not going to export either. So that is too naive, too simple. Now, I'm not saying there are certain taxes, and there are certain taxes on people, on businesses, in certain sectors that don't have a Laffer effect, i.e. that if we reduce them, we'll get more activity. But simply saying across the board, we know that will help us, I'm telling you, there is in no country in the world empirical evidence that it does this. And so it actually comes back to, please check and think about the evidence. Don't make it a slogan and claim Mr. Laffer is there. Laffer may exist as an analytical tool, but it will require very careful analysis. And not a back-of-the-envelope calculation. So, sugar rush is not the answer. And I'll come back what potential is, because I will agree with you taxes are too high. But sugar rush is not the answer. I will agree with you taxes are too high. And I'll come back to that. The second thing is that I see a deeper malaise, and it links a little bit why many of you will not respond even if CIT goes down by 1%. Well, because there's a lot of things that are wrong in the economy. And Mr. Usman Wahed has already mentioned it, we are quite a rent-seeking economy. And put it slightly differently, I'm not saying you do, but you would know how to get things done in this economy. There are ways to get things done in the economy. There are ways to get around the regulations. And that can include having the WhatsApp number of the relative secretary or minister, or it can have other means. The first one is just lobbying. The other one can be other means. This is an economy that is endlessly not just over-regulated, but with endless exemptions, with endless ways of getting different playing fields for different players. So what I do here is that saying, look, we want all kinds of support, but meanwhile, all the other stuff is happening and all the other way of doing it. So if and I'll give you one example. And look, I totally understand, I'm an economist, how people respond to incentives. There's been a fast growth of registrations of companies in Pakistan, in Dubai, and other places in recent times. We are fully aware that because of, and probably it was because something that looked temporary became permanent. Take the super tax. And certain things gave you an impetus to actually say, look, this tax climate, I need to do tax optimization. That's normally what firms do, tax optimization. That's not evasions. That's simply optimization. And so you move there. Now, if a tax were to be reversed today, I doubt that many will close these operations abroad now and suddenly say, oh, this is enough, I'll move it here, because you've done the fixed cost, you've set up the other places, you've optimized for that, why would you change it? Okay? And I understand that. So the asymmetry is also there. You want to be very careful. So it's not as if there is a simple silver bullet here that everything suddenly will be good again. Similarly, certain firms have optimized because the incentives are such that actually moving your payroll abroad. Well, I understand that you do this because that's a sensible, smart move. But it doesn't mean that if we do a slight change in this whole thing, because we can't abolish taxation of freelancers. If we do a slight change, will it be enough? I'm not so sure it will be. The asymmetry in measures is there as well. So even though I can agree with the diagnosis that some of these things were poorly designed, reversing it may not get us the behavioral response it is. That's why I was saying, if we want to build this economy, we'll need to be very, very careful. Let me rush a little bit in the interest of time. What would I then propose? Okay, what would I then propose? Look, and don't expect me here an exact number on something here and there. That's not my role. But I'll tell you broad lines where there's 3 areas I want to do. Okay, was amazed that the people that in the system had been arguing for a gradual tariff liberalization over 5 years, I was amazed that these people were there, they did the homework, they did well, and Prime Minister was convinced. That's the kind of thing you want to do, because that's the first thing I said of the 3 things that the countries that were successful had done. They were outward-oriented. And I want to just emphasize why that is so important. That's not because actually the trade balance is not an accountancy relationship. I can suppress imports or I can promote exports. The trade balance provides incentives. If I'm exporting, I need to compete with the best and have incentives to keep on being more productive and think imaginative, how can I capture and keep my markets? If I'm import substituting, the only thing I really need is to have a permanent room in the Marriott or the Serena and being regularly in touch with the secretary, as long as they keep on giving me a new RD, because I claim that everybody else is doing dumping and I don't have to bother with. I only need the tariff to actually keep my bottom line intact. I just need a tariff to have my bottom line intact. Compared to the exporters, I need to compete. What is better for an economy? Discuss. I could set it as an exam question for my students in Oxford. I can assure you that Vietnam and India did, okay? They were consciously choosing not to go through this. And you could say, well, we need protection because we need to learn to be competitive. Well, there's some of these industries, they've got that for 30 years. If you have to do learning by doing, then I ask myself, what have you been learning and what the hell have you been doing as well? And that's actually why I actually think. But you don't do it as a shock, because it is tough. It's structural reforms. So you actually say, look, we're going to do this over 5 years, and I understand that's what were the approved proposals of the tariff board. That's what Minister Aurangzeb, Finance Minister, will gradually implement. We create some clarity here. We create some policy certainty. And that's why it's important. It may not be serving everybody in the same way. Indeed, it may hurt some firms, but at least we create clarity that that's the path in 5 years. The second one that I'm related and I want to talk about is then broader policy certainty. This is the example. How do we create broader policy certainty? I was very struck that in the business risk surveys, that's number one, the ones that actually does the OICCI. That's number one item that people are concerned with. I've talked over my career enough with business people. They know how to deal with things, but they can't deal with policy uncertainty and rapid changes. You know, you react to incentives, but you want to have some clarity what these incentives are. Policy certainty is the first thing. In fact, you can deal with taxation as long as you know what it is. And may have already alluded to, yes, you do tax optimization or whatever. But basically, you want certainty because then you can run a business. You don't want uncertainty. So that's the proposal that I would say. Why don't we work carefully with people like you in the room and try to think of what would be a sensible path to a better taxation regime over the next few years would be, where businesses don't have distortions, where there is more level playing field. Yes, I know that you may say words like retailers and so on. We need to keep on working on that, but within the formal sector businesses, okay, how do we make it more rational? Or to use the words of Finance Minister, how do we calibrate this in the first instance and then see how far we can get? If growth comes to the economy and we can keep it without going to the IMF, then I think you're in the business of, okay, then the tax burden can also go further and further down and you can get further things. So why don't we have a 5-year fiscal framework that we work on, that creates some certainty just as was with the tariffs, and try to create incentives, including making sure politicians stick to it rather than every year trying to renegotiate it as well. And that would be actually quite helpful. And that leads me to the final one. It's what I touched upon, is the things that are not quite right, that are clearly harder but important. You know, commercial law, contracting enforcement, possible proper clarity about all these things. It will take some time. It takes a particular way that the government needs to operate and not overturn it, not giving exemptions unfairly to some and not to others. We need to keep on working on that. That will take time. The structures are not favorable for it. Let's say there's multiple stakeholders that are competing on some of these things. Similarly with regulatory reform, try to make it simpler. Let's not try new regulation that overcomes other distortions and actually work on it. And actually, by the way, I'm in the business of receiving concrete proposals of things that can be done in the short run that actually can make businesses' life more easier. I'm not saying I can implement it, but I'm definitely in the business to talk to whoever I can talk to if these are sensible things. And by the way, some of the measures that have happened already, lots of small things from consultations with business, several of them were taken forward because they can be done quickly, they can be done without big distortions and so on. And it leads me to actually concluding here is to say, look, these steps towards long-term reform, they need to be taken today. I understand politics is complicated. Let's say there's multiple layers of stakeholders that we need to get on board on all kinds of things. That means it will take time, and there's other types of reforms that you may want, not talking about. But within that, what we have, creating policy stability will be in the interest of the political class, the bureaucratic class, the business class, and other stakeholders as well, and creating a clarity of it. But we need to make sure that the push that is there doesn't just simply want to create sugar, but actually create something else as well. I want to end here with a brief, quick reminder of another country that did serious reforms 30 years ago. One of the ones that actually were well involved, were well in that list of better growth countries. It's your eastern neighbor. In 1991, they did reforms. Everybody thinks, the minister suddenly had a great idea, or Monte Calualia had a great idea, and the minister said, yeah, great, we'll just implement it, and all of it's going to be easy. The biggest opponents of this reform were some group called the Bombay Club, and they used all the business associations and the business councils to mobilize. And who was behind it? Mr. Tata, Mr. Birla, and Mr. Bajaj. By the way, they're all billionaires now thanks to the reforms. But they knew how to do business in that country in the way that Usman described. They knew how to do business. They didn't want change because it works for me. Why would I want change? Yes, I can make noise, but meanwhile I pick up the phone, or I get an exemption, or I find a way, or dare I say I pay a bribe. I can do business. I know how to do it. I know my country. I can handle this. Meanwhile, I make the shouts and all the right noises, but they were lobbying. And you know what they wrote and what they said? There's no way we can export already because electricity tariffs are too high, taxes are too high, and the regulation is all against us. My God, I saw that list recently from some business council. It's the same list in every country. And we get numbers thrown at you that I will say are not correct from other countries and neighborhoods. Yes, you're bad. You're not in a good state in these things. But numbers are thrown around that don't add up, that are not fair representations of the distortions that you have relative to other countries. Manmohan Singh pushed it through. Yes, they listened, and they slowed a few things down, they consulted. They didn't stop what the Bombay Club were asking for, but they consulted and they worked with business to make it make sense. And over the 1990s, they pushed the reforms through. Because one thing, if you're a student of reforms in India, it wasn't Big Bang, it wasn't Millet that some people may dream of. Politically, you couldn't do a Millet in this country, okay? But they worked with them, and they learned to work together. And by the end of the 1990s, every political party, including all the ones that voted against the reforms, were big fans of India shining, India rising, including the current government party. They weren't initially. You bring them on board, but be sensible, be realistic. So for me, no sugar rush, no silly things, and you have to help no measures are done. But let's find ways of working together, business associations, academics, and others, to actually sensible reforms that are feasible in the short run and that actually can deliver over time, over the next few years, the kind of structural reforms you're all craving for. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dercon. I think as Pakistanis, it was difficult for all of us to hear some of the numbers that you shared. And it's always difficult to hear that Pakistan stayed behind, but none of us are surprised. But I think your reflections really, more than anything, should give all of us in the room much to consider about how, as you said, we can become better partners in thinking through how we can get through this together. And I think you segued beautifully into our panel discussion for this evening that brings Pakistan's specifics into focus. And we look at not just the real economy, but Pakistan's long-term priorities on reform and competitiveness. And I want to request Dr. Dercon to please join us on stage for the panel as well. If you could please join us, thank you so much. Please allow me to introduce our panelists for this evening as well. I'd like to first invite the State Minister for Finance and Railways, Mr. Bilal Azhar Kayani. With his current role, Mr. Kayani brings first-hand insight into fiscal policy making and public sector reform with direct engagement in shaping Pakistan's economic direction. As Usman Saab said, a lot weighs on Mr. Kayani's shoulders. I'd also like to now invite Mr. Ali Naseer, the Chief Strategy Officer at JAZ. Please welcome Mr. Naseer. Mr. Naseer brings deep experience in corporate strategy and digital transformation, and he brings the private sector perspective to this conversation, especially on innovation and competitiveness. And moderating today's discussion is Dr. Ali Hasanain, the Associate Professor of Economics at LUMS. Please welcome Dr. Hasanain. Dr. Hasanain is widely respected for his research on governance and public policy and regulation. We're really pleased to have him steer this conversation. It's an arguably difficult job to do. So, Dr. Hasanain, over to you. Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to be here to welcome many of the people who've been in LUMS in one way or the other over the past few years, and also to continue to have these conversations around the Pakistan economy. When we started to think about whether to have this panel, my mind went to all of the other panels that we've had over the years. I'm sure that this is not the first such panel that you've attended. But then I thought, a Pakistan without such conversations is certainly poorer than one with them. And over the next few months and years, LUMS is committed to also try and develop further of a presence in the national conversation, and we hope that you'll see more of us in that. But let me start, Stefan, you're a friend, but I must say you've been a terrible disappointment to Pakistan. We were expecting you to come in with a magic button that we could press, and we keep doing the same things we've been doing for the last 60, 70 years, but we can get growth to 8%. And you haven't really given us that button. So part of I guess, how I think of the economy is to trace back the history of economic policy thought in Pakistan. And one that's really that stayed with me is that in 91, Nawaz Sharif invited Lee Kuan Yew, the famous statesman from Singapore, to come and do a diagnosis of Pakistan's economic problems. And I mention this regularly and on various fora. And he came in and he spent a few days here. This is the guy who took Singapore from a fishing village to what it is today. And he left us a prescription. He said, you've got low taxes, you subsidize the wrong things, you spend too much money on defense and debt. And he gave us a list of about 20 things. And if you read that list today, it still reads quite like some of the things that Stefan and others have been saying. So I think one part of the conversation, perhaps maybe in the next however long we have you for, or in future conversations, what I'd like us to think about is what is it beyond thought that is missing and that enables development to start. But let me start with Ali Naseer. You're the main representative of the business community here, right? The rest of us are either policy thinkers or doers. Give us a picture of how your company and you in general see strengths and weaknesses in Pakistan for businesses.
Sure, thank you, Ali. Honestly, I don't think I can give a better prescription than Professor Dercon just did. And he laid out exactly what is wrong with us and what needs to be corrected. I think from a private sector investor, Jazz happens to be one of the largest foreign direct investments in Pakistan. And despite ups and downs, we've stayed in Pakistan and continue to do well, I would argue. My perspective may be slightly different from other business people because honestly, for me, what is important, and I've been on the other side of the table as well in government, is the consistency of policy that Dr. Dercon talked about. Stabilization, like he said, is good. We need better policies. I actually argue one of the worst things that has happened in Pakistan is policy reversals. It's not the absence of good or bad policies. It's when policies are put out and a couple of years later they are reversed or completely turned around. And while, of course, that is not the only reason why the private sector has not done well, and I think Professor Dercon shared how productivity in other countries have been much better, Bombay clubs efforts not succeeding, etc., is frankly because this short-termism leads business to survive for the next fiscal year. They know that the policy is going to be reversed, so why not just make sure your head's above water and you do enough to rise this tide, right? So essentially policy reversals, and I'm not going to talk about taxation, it is a fact of life. Yes, it can be better, but I think that we can deal with. I've also had some economics training, and I feel one of the big things in Pakistan, and I often tell my parents this as well, that your generation failed us. It's a very interesting argument we have with them. And he says, okay, let's see what yours will do better. It hasn't done better, by the way, and I'll probably stand up for that now. It's the burdens on our kids. Is essentially we've survived on these rent-seeking opportunities. I don't think Pakistani business, private sector, has done enough to challenge themselves to be competitive at the global stage. We missed the manufacturing, which Asia did earlier on. I think that ship has sailed. I do believe, and we maybe get later in the conversation, on what then is Pakistan's competitive advantage today and how do we leverage that. But I'll leave it at that.
All right, so great. So, but I'd push you a bit on that though, because it's very rare that you see companies in isolation grow in countries that aren't doing well, right? So while it might be true that businesses have their own failings, there's certainly truth to the fact that there's an enabling environment. That's the job of government, right? So I guess that this is a good sort of segue to my principal question for the Minister Bilal. Not Bilal Kayani, but as government, we have a lot of policy instability. Stefan said so, Ali said so. And the Dercon plan is one of about 5 or 6 different formal plans that we've seen by this government. And then there are informal plans and committees that I've been a part of. Certainly you've seen probably more than that. What is the one plan that the government has, and where can I read it?
So, thank you. First of all, I'd like to, before I answer the question, thank Usman Saab, ABF and LUMS for this opportunity. And I think it's always a learning experience for us as well. Some of us, and I see various faces here with whom we are in the meeting room very often, including Professor Dercon. But I think it's always helpful to bring the conversation to forums like this, and it keeps on enabling us to fine-tune and really strike the right balance between the various priorities. One thing I will say very quickly, and I realize there is the match and there is the time constraint, but I was nearly a LUMS alumni myself. I attended the orientation and then got pulled out by my father and ended up studying economics at UCL. But I appreciate how great a school it is. And in addition to that, I will say that we also have LUMS academics who are regularly part of the discussions that we have. So we have Dr. Ijaz Nabi, who is perhaps, of all the people at LUMS, the most involved in some of the policy making and policy discussions at the highest level. Dr. Ali Chima, I've had the chance of recently being on a panel with. We know I once took half an hour of Dr. Ali's time just to talk about the exchange rate and rare. So I think that these various inputs and dialogues are important. Now to your question, I think that it's important to distinguish between two things. One is the policy itself, and the second is the dialogue. And I think some of the committees you were on was part of the dialogue. And I mean, last year, the Prime Minister has always invited people from the private sector in various discussions. But I think last year, a few months back, in October in fact, we made a really concerted effort to really make sure that we get businessmen and business persons on the table, a diverse group of people, male and female, local businesses, international businesses, SMEs. We tried to get them around the table. We had a 3-hour session, which you were a part of. And the idea was just to listen to the problems, the feedback, what's working, what's not. And then that led to 9 working groups, which were all led by the private sector on various topics, from taxation to energy to the Export Development Fund, trade, etc. And you know the details of that, and we can dive into that later on in the session if you'd like. And so the idea is to constantly have that feedback loop and that discussion, so that the government doesn't carry out decision making in a vacuum, in an echo chamber. The Prime Minister, even internally, always invites debate. I will be the first one to say, I never feel inhibited in voicing my views and contradicting what's being said in the room. And that is exactly why he invites people from the business sector, because we genuinely believe that the actual job creation, the actual growth, the actual exports have to all come from the private sector. So whilst we are making policies that are supposed to enable and unlock businesses to achieve that growth, we cannot do that without listening to them. In addition to that, we also carry out regular meetings with the chambers. After every month or a month and a half, we invite the presidents of all chambers. And in fact, that's something I do at the direction of the Prime Minister. We have representatives of various ministries, and we have the presidents of all chambers. APTEMA is there, PBC is there, and from the next meeting, I'll personally ensure that ABF is also there. And so we'll do that going forward. But to your question, I think that first and foremost, if you're looking for what the government's policy is, or what is the government actually following, you have to look at the policy that's already in place. I think the national tariff policy is one good example of it. It's a good example of the government's intent. It's also a good example of the government's commitment to policy. Because the national tariff policy is not something that we have just announced as some flowery economic concept. It's something which is quite drastic. In the face of tariff walls being put up worldwide now, we have drastically reduced tariffs, or committed to reducing tariffs over 5 years. And the first year of those 5 years is already in place. And I don't want to get into the details of the sort of resistance that we have seen, that Dr. Dercon, Professor Dercon alluded to earlier. We face that, but we are sticking to it. But at the same time, we cannot then just sit in a room and not listen to the issues that people have. So we make sure we continuously have a dialogue, and wherever there's a genuine issue, we try to address it. I think the resolution to some of the problems or difficulties that the economy will face as a result of the tariff policy does not lie in constantly tinkering with the tariffs, but lies in a stronger National Tariff Commission, which is what we are working on. So that's just one example. But I will say one thing. I think that we have various committees. We have Udan Pakistan, which is a document that has a sort of a goalpost. But I do agree that there is room for us to have more coherent economic plans. And this has been a problem since my birth. It's not now. I think that governments overall have to become better at having an economic plan which is similar to the way the tariff policy is, with a 5-year vision, with a stated mission, with a stated quantifiable goal. We have that in the shape of Udan Pakistan, but I think we are still trying to make sure that we can marry it better with the actual policies that the ministries are making. I think the Prime Minister himself does the coordination job itself, but we are working on institutionalizing this coordination better than it is right now.
Fantastic. So I've been witness myself to the Prime Minister's willingness to sort of invite criticism and debate. My concern, though, is that we need one definitive document for the country to sort of to cohere around, and to have the definitive view of the Prime Minister after he's heard everyone and consulted with whatever. So one hopes that we will be able to consolidate down to one Pakistani economic plan. I understand also that there's always, in any country, there are interest groups and there's lobbying, and that's part of the process. But Stefan, so tell us a little bit about, there might be people in the room who don't understand the need for this national tariff plan, the national tariff reforms. We know that there was work both by academics and policymakers that created some of the evidence around what happened over the last 10 years. So very briefly, for people in the room who might not know this, Pakistan saw an uptick in the amount of protection that we've had for certain industries, both around 2013 and around 2018, by both governments of the time. So it was across parties. And that's led to concerns, especially around export promotion. But if you can tell us a little bit more about that and what's been going on, and maybe give us a little bit of texture to the type of conversations, also of where the resistance has been coming from.
Right. Well, look, you're already alluding to it, is that, and it was a very striking thing that since 2013 and 18, and in fact also in recent years, if you were to take the customs duty, the tariff on its own, it looked all okay. You could go to a WTO publication and say, oh, it's all quite all right. But actually, there was something going fundamentally wrong, because when tariffs become largely a tool of revenue collection, and on top of that, largely a tool of special interests, then actually it goes really wrong. And actually, there was a sequence clearly over the years that this was actually, the economic meaning of it was such that actually, Usman mentioned rent seeking. That became a very useful tool for rent seeking. This declaring someone is dumping on me, doing the right conversation, and so on. So it lost all the economic meaning of actually having somehow a coherent framework around it. Now, the figures were stark, and definitely academic research, including by Professor Pizzarda from Bristol, people like Dr. Gonzalo, who was a World Bank official, and several other people had done in bits and pieces research actually showing it actually makes a big difference in what it is. And of course, the international experience, I was referring to it, is just the countries who actually took that on and, were thinking carefully, not least in this whole period, taking advantage of the opportunities there. And it's one of these strange things. Why would I do import liberalization to actually encourage exports? Well, it actually is to do with, benchmarking yourself relative to the world economy, so you kind of get a sense of what competitiveness looks like. And, I know this is the American Business Council, let's not talk what a very large country that has all kinds of other powers in markets can do. But if you're a small open economy, which in economic terms Pakistan is, you need to get that benchmarking and measure yourself against it. So you kind of need to have that, otherwise you have no competitiveness benchmark, but also no sense of where in the future my export opportunities or other opportunities would lie. And so you kind of want to be clear, it's not about zero tariffs entirely. You want especially on inputs, and inputs, of course, an output of one industry may be an input in another industry, so you want to be very careful. You want to also look at capital goods and so on, that actually you want to make sure that this, so you want to have a structure that makes economic sense, that doesn't have distortions. But at the same time, and I know, Ali, you have written about it in a concerned sort of way, you can't just turn the switch and then suddenly think everything is fine. And there, and I'll say something about the US, is that saying even there is a lot of now tinkering, because actually just turning the switch doesn't make that so much sense either. So there's a lot of kind of finding an equilibrium, the right thing. And so this is not what we propose. This is why we had a 5-year tariff policy. The research that was done projecting what the impact could be of this, and there is benchmarks of models, ways of analyzing this, suggest, and I hope I will quote it exactly right now, and that may not be exactly precise, but I know for one thing, the projection suggests 350,000 new jobs if you implemented it in 5 years. Net new jobs, 350,000. I think an export increase by up to 13% under some scenarios, and a GDP growth effect cumulatively over multiple years of several percentage points. And so if you think of it, that's a policy that if you worry about some tariff revenue, it will pay for itself. Now, it is a relative price change, so there will be certain industries that actually will be doing. That's also the 5 years is very important. There are certain industries, I don't have to explain which industries have incredibly high protection in this country.
Stefan, if I can just interrupt,
Yeah.
because we're short on time, I want to just compress a bit. But I'll tell you the industries, because I've got no stakes. It's very easy for me to say these things. We should absolutely not be manufacturing automobiles in this country.
Yes.
The total volume of I don't know if there's an automobile manufacturer here. Apologies if there is, but the fact is that we produce about 125,000 odd vehicles a year, which is less than half the size of a decent sized plant anywhere else in the world. And Bilal, I'll come to you on this. We were hoping to have the Secretary Industries. He wasn't able to manage. I would have posed this to him. there are industries where you can make an argument that we have a policy that we'll be able to see it to a point where it becomes a growth enabler rather than a drag on growth. Mobile manufacturing arguably is one. Farooq Saab is here, maybe durable goods might be one. And you have to look at the unit economies of and where break-even would happen, and then you have to have ecosystems that are created. And the other thing is, with our sort of special economic zones, we spread manufacturing all over the country. Like Eid pe jo badi Eid pe jo gosht padta hai, we distribute it all over the place. But in the case of industries, barkat nahi aati usse, right? You have to create concentrations and agglomeration. We haven't done that. Bilal, is there a view about how Pakistan's industries will look different in 5-7 years in terms of the specific industries that the government has?
So I think the first thing that I will say about that is I think the government has to, we need less government, not more. That's one of the things we're working on. The government needs to get out of the way. I think there's too much government. And what that means is that whilst the government has to create an enabling environment and has to identify where really our biggest or lowest hanging fruits are for exports, what we really have to do is really unlock things for the private sector. I don't think that the government can do a better job than the private sector at attracting FDI. I think that once your local business stories of deployed capital by MNCs or foreign firms or local firms, once those stories become better, the FDI will follow. I think the private sectors will always do a better job of speaking to each other and attracting FDI.
Sorry, I got to push you there though, because it's great that the private sector brings in FDI, but what I want to know is the government going to restrict the enabling environment it creates away from some industries and more to, are we going to have selective industrial policy, or are we willing to protect anyone who brings in investments?
So I think currently the industrial policy will come out when it will come out, and I think the Minister of Industries will speak to that. But the idea is to move away from picking winners, largely speaking, and to really reduce distortions rather than create more. And so I will say a couple of things because I think it's important from this panel, and I think because I represent the government, I would say that the government has shown very strong commitment to continuity of policy. And when you talk about structural reforms, it's not just the tariff policy. It's also the stabilization that has been achieved over the past 2 years in terms of broadening the tax net, what we are getting from digital monitoring in the cement or tobacco sectors or sugar sectors now. That's all there. But in addition to that, I think now there has to be a laser focus on ensuring that any export we have, any FDI we have, is export led. And in addition to that, I think that we really have to make sure that we strengthen the hand of existing businesses, and we also make sure that, as Professor Dercon alluded earlier, the cost of doing business has to reduce, but the cost of doing business has been lowered before as well. And that hasn't automatically resulted in exports. Even if you look at the 2013 to 18 environment, I think policy rate was at 5 to 6%. Tax rates and costs were much lower. Tariff costs were much lower. Electricity power costs were much lower. But we didn't automatically have exports. So we'll need to really nudge the economy in that direction. I think the tariff policy will play an important role because of the competitiveness that it will bring. The deepest cuts in the tariff policy are on the raw materials and intermediate goods to enable that to happen. And in addition to that, I think the privatization program that the government is carrying on, I think is one of the biggest signals of government's commitment to structural reforms. PIA, many governments have tried to privatize before. And I can tell you, as someone who sits in government, even when this privatization was in its final stages, we had voices who would come in and say, you just watch, this isn't going to happen. This will get sabotaged. Vested interests will not let it happen, but it happened. And now we're working on privatizing 3 of the distribution companies, and I think we should privatize away as much as possible. So I think, in a nutshell, I think the government has to reduce its footprint, not just in terms of the companies it runs, not just in terms of the regulatory red tape it has, not just in terms of the costs it it imposes, but also in terms of becoming, lording over who are the winners and losers that it should select. I think we just have to create an enabling environment and then really make sure the government remains in listening mode and really clears the path for businesses to grow and for non-exporting sectors to also become exporting sectors. One final thought, I realize I've taken up more than my fair share of my time. I will say this, in my experience of now having consulted extensively with businesses, I think we have the forums like the ABF and OICCI, and we have several established big businesses and MNCs, and then we have the chambers. But what we are lacking is really representation of everyone in between, which are primarily the SMEs who are trying to grow and become, exporters. And sometimes I don't feel it's easy for me to reach them in an organized manner, and I don't think it's easy for them to reach me or our government in an organized manner. So that's also something we're working on, and I think the revamping of SMEDA that the Prime Minister himself is overseeing will help.
That's a great point. In fact, I think also that consumers are not well represented in these conversations, usually businesses. There's a lot to litigate, but I don't want to take away too many overs from the match. One thing that I'll litigate, but I'll take this to the next question to Ali Saab, is that when you say that we want a level playing field, that's great, but then it's also the case that whenever you're protecting an industry, that you're not creating a level playing field, and therefore there has to be a rule-based way of doing industrial policy. In the entire world is doing industrial policy today, which is essentially picking winners. But so the concern here is that we'd end up providing benefits that are costly to the consumer, to anyone who asks, and not create those agglomeration economies that we want to create. But Alisa, tell us, we've spoken privately a bit about potential growth levers and industrial policy. What are some ideas that perhaps come from telecom on that?
Gee, thank you, Ali. Actually, I just wanted to put in a data point to support Bilal's work on how the government is consulting with the private sector. Actually, the spectrum auction that is going to happen next month is probably the best spectrum auction policy we've ever seen in Pakistan's history. Typically, all those spectrums were revenue-generating measures with the government. This is the first time that the prices set, the bandwidth, is lower than global benchmarks. And that didn't happen by fluke. It was a result of active collaboration of the private sector, advocacy. Policy is still not perfect. I still have a couple of issues, and we tried till the very last minute, but that didn't work out. That's okay. So I think while it's happening in fits and starts, it is happening, and the more of these instances will come out, hopefully with benefit. I think, Ali, you pressed Bilal on which is a winner industry. I belong to telecoms, but I will not say telecoms is the winner. I would actually expand that to say digital is the winner. It is honestly, I am not a techie. I'm an economist by training and was imported into the telecom sector. And we've been working very hard at Jazz to kind of move the digital envelope a little bit. We're not there yet. But as I see it, as an economist, as a Pakistani, honestly, I think that's the one salvation we have. If the government were to pick Bilal one industry that they want to support, it should be digitalization. I know you're part of the cashless society and all, there's some good initiatives happening, but we need more of that. And that does not mean anything or any business can set up the digital word in front of the industry and suddenly say we're digital. You held that with health tech and education tech and insure tech. Everyone just puts tech and says we're digital. For example, I take data centers, and there may be people building data centers in Pakistan. Data centers will not work for Pakistan. Why will they not work? Because data centers require GPUs, which Pakistan currently can't get the best of. They require reasonable energy to run, which we do not have. And they have skilled manpower, which we do have. But unfortunately, the opportunities they have elsewhere, we cannot maintain and keep them here. So the three things that you need to make data center an export market, we will never get. Right? So even within the digital space, the government needs to be very smart about what they're betting on. Last point about AI, the government came out with a draft AI policy. I think it's sensible. We've worked with the government, so a lot of our input is there. However, Bilal, maybe just feedback, like you mentioned, one of the things the policy said was the government will set up centers of excellence. That should not be the case. Right? The government should set up guardrails, enable, and then invite the private sector to say, now sink or swim. So I think while there is effort to involve the the private sector, and I think certainly in our case, there has been recognition of that and we're active partners. I think more of that needs to happen. And I would argue, Ali, if there's a digital winner the government of Pakistan needs to put for a future, it is that area that really needs to be strengthened.
I'd love to get into this. I'm just started teaching a course on the economics of AI at LUMS this semester. So it's just a very rich world to engage with. But we're over time. Bilal, I'll ask both of you a couple of questions in closing. Give me one thing that you think this government hasn't done well so far, that you think needs more acceleration, and one sort of thing that's maybe in the works that you think has of promise. And Stefan, then I'll give you the closing word after that, please.
I think that we can privatize faster, and I think we're going to try and do that. I think the privatization of PIA has given us the impetus for that. I think the second thing, when we talk about structural things, where I think we will need a more national conversation, and perhaps the federal government will also now think about doing it, is to really seriously look at revisiting the NFC. And I think that's at the root of some of the problems that we face. The sort of imbalance that we have between the federal government and the provinces leads to a lot of other fiscal issues, which then creates other problems. I was so focused on answering your negative question, I've forgotten the positive one.
That's fine. We'll take that as the state of the world. We'll take that.
What was the question? It was something about...
Give me something that's promising on the inside that you think isn't well known, but maybe that we might see.
Two things very quickly. Recent examples. Small stories, like Stefan mentioned. One of the outcomes, this is a very small, good story about the private sector participation leading to a tangible outcome. One of the working groups that the Prime Minister formed was on the Export Development Fund. This is a 52 billion rupee fund, which was created some time ago to fund common facilities for the development of exports. It was financed through taxing exports by 0.25% of export revenues. The working group gave us two suggestions. One, kill the surcharge because it's a tax on exports and we have enough money for the next 2-3 years. And two, the government shouldn't run it, exporters and the private sector should. We implemented both of these through legislation in Parliament. And now we don't have an export development surcharge, and we are about to formally announce a private sector board for that, which will hopefully, these 50 billion rupees will now be used by decision making by the private sector for exporters to enable existing exporters and to help potential exporters. The second story, promising, is cashless. It's something where I wish I'm very happy to have Ali Saab here, but Amir, because we've been a part of that journey, the cashless Pakistan initiative that the Prime Minister is leading, I think there's a lot of potential there. You've got 17 trillions of P2G and 24 trillion of G2P transactions every year that we're trying to digitize. So the aim is by the end of this year, there shouldn't be a single government-to-person payment that should not be digital. That should be fully digital. That means no vendor, no employee, no pensioner should have to visit an office. That is just one part of what we're working on. We're trying to increase QR codes. We're trying to increase the number of active digital transactions. So I think that's really promising, and that will increase transparency, that will reduce the cost in the system, and that will increase the convenience of the customer and the citizen.
Fantastic. So there are a lot of sidebar conversations that I have to not get into given the time. One thing with cashless is that one hopes that we'll eventually get to documenting more of the economy and expanding the tax net. Couldn't have finished a conversation on the economy without mentioning tax to GDP. But there is already a lot of data in the system that we're not leveraging, and we haven't done for 20 years. But I'll resist the temptation to get into that. The other thing, Stefan, is that it's almost as if the magic button we found is the NFC. There is something to be said for the government's view, but there's also a very important view that is not really able to inject itself into the system right now. But again, that's just a sidebar note. What's the magic button you found for us now?
No, it's just like a few things. Let me quickly say just a few reflections here. And it's actually a lot to do with points that you made, Ali. And usually, as usual, I'm mostly agreeing with you, but a few things I disagree with you. And it actually is still helpful. You know, the long-range magic bullet, the 8% growth. What I've learned in working in different countries with policymakers, the biggest enemy for the long run is the short run. And the hardest thing is actually how do you get this path going? So endless people can say, I saw a Dawn article, all the things that need to happen now, but you can't have it, you know? When President Ghani came to power in Afghanistan, he had written a book, How to Fix the Failed State. He had 156 things that needed to be done. He didn't deliver anything. Okay, so a long list of things to deliver can't work. So you need to find ways of prioritizing. So, and it relates to that is that, you know, you said we need to plan. I'm actually sometimes worried. When I look at the experience of countries that made progress, they didn't necessarily have a plan. But they did have a framework. They had consistency. Okay? So don't look for the elusive development plan because that's 1950s stuff. You did it well in the 1950s, by the way. But that's not necessarily 2030s or 2020s. But you need a framework for consistency. And so you need to look for consistency that can be formal, that can be informal. And I like the things, you know, I tend to agree with what Minister is saying here. You know, get the government a bit out of the way. Let's in the first instance get the horizontal policy right before we start picking the winners. And in fact, if he could have answered which sector will be important in 5 years, then it was wrong. You know, that's not how you build an economy. You can't plan which will be the leading thing. We don't know, but create the environment in which you can flourish. And the main thing is then, in that sense, don't do stupid things. You know, just don't try to put all your eggs in the final basket. And that leads me to the final point here, is that what you need is in a way to get that path from the short run to the long run. Successful change, even Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, was actually getting people on side, finding a way to get his own bureaucracy on side, getting ways to get business communities on side. It's about growth coalitions. Success comes from coalitions for growth. Basically, business community, politicians, across divides, you know, they may disagree about lots of things, but they could start agreeing on a few things, and other stakeholders, provinces, and so on, that you actually bring them there. And beginning to say, look, sensible things, you know, can we agree about sensible things and do this? And it's a little bit the way I see what Prime Minister or Minister Bilal has to do. It's a bit like in a cricket match, you know. You start, as Pakistan seemed to have started, with taking some quick wickets, or at least one. You need some quick successes, but then you build it up. And you can't win the match by not taking a wicket at a time. And so this may be what we should be doing now, looking forward to.
So if we didn't have a cricket match, we'd keep talking and thrash out our differences. But with that, we'll bring it to close. Thank you so much to all three of you for being here.
Thank you very much.